told, time for secrets to unfold. It's our time to come of age, time for truth to turn the page. Don't wanna be inside the dark, live within a question mark. Will be a friend or foe? Tell me now. We need to know. Need to know. We need to know. Need to know.
The Extraordinary Phenomenon Investigations Council presents Epic Voyages. Come join us as we enter and experience the great mysteries of the world with tonight's host,
Dr. Joseph Burkes.
Too much to learn, you say. Cover up is fine, that's your plan, not mine. I'm ready to be told, time for secrets to unfold. It's our time to come of age, time for truth to turn the page. Don't wanna be inside the dark, live within a question mark. Will be a friend or foe? Tell me now. We need to know. Need to know.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Joseph Burkes, and you are listening to Epic Voyages on the Inception Radio Network. Tonight we have a guest we're speaking to in Europe. That's right. His name is Gerard Aartsen. He's Dutch, and he's an English language instructor, author, and lecturer. During his youth and young adult years, he traveled the world as a backpacker. In the late 1990s, what he described as his, quote, hippie days, quote unquote, came to an end, and he received an educational degree from Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. There he has held a teaching position in the Department of Secondary Education since 2001. Gerard Aartsen has studied the teachings of the early contactees, and in 2008 published the book George Adamski, A Herald for Space Brothers. I correct, that was 2010. Subsequently, he has written Here to Help, UFOs and the Space Brothers, and in 2015, his latest work is titled Priorities for a Planet in Transition, The Space Brothers' Case for Justice and Freedom. He is a frequent guest on international radio and TV shows about UFOs and related subjects. So I welcome to Epic Voyages on the Inception Radio Network, Mr. Gerard Aartsen. Are you there, Gerard?
Hello, Joseph. I'm here. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on your show. It's a pleasure.
It's really a great pleasure. I discovered you through my association with Free, Ray Hernandez, as well as Reverend Carter. Both of them gave me the recommendation, and I was fascinated to read most of your latest book because it deals with a subject that I've known about, but not very much, and that is the writings of and the philosophy of the early contactees. So maybe we can talk about you as a person first and your travels and how that rounded you out as an individual and gave you a very broad perspective on this subject, and then get into the specific UFO studies, both past contactees as well as more current ones. So let's find out how you became a world traveler.
Well, I actually don't know if my life is very interesting, but I simply didn't know what I wanted to study when I graduated from high school, from secondary school. It had prepared me, normally speaking, to go into university. And I wasn't ready to focus in on a certain subject that I would of a very limited scope that I would know everything about after 5 or 6 years. I just didn't know what subject to pick. That year I heard from 2 friends who were going to travel overland to India, which was still possible then, from Amsterdam to India and Nepal. And many people even went beyond there. So I decided to ask them if it was all right that I joined them. And fortunately, they said yes. And we set off, the 3 of us, hitchhiking to Istanbul. And from there, we traveled on buses through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal. Got stuck in Nepal because it's such a beautiful country. And the whole journey took me about 6 months, and I enjoyed Nepal and India so much that I went back there 5 times. Wow. Not overland, but by airplane. And I traveled. The first time in Nepal, I met people from all over the place: England, Australia, the US. And on my subsequent travels, I went to visit several of them, including those in the US and in Japan.
I see. Well, you say overland travel, so let's mention to our listeners the significance of that. That region has been plunged into war. First, there was the Soviet invasion, 1979, I believe, at the end of the Carter administration. And
that was the excuse me. I think that was the Islamic Revolution in Iran in '79, and then in 1980 the Russians invaded Afghanistan.
Right, 1980. Good.
Yeah, and shortly after that, there was a coup in Turkey, military coup. Yes, the whole region became inaccessible for overland travel.
Right. So you really got a unique experience at a time just before it ended. What year did you make your first 6-month journey by land?
That was 1977.
Right.
Yes.
So you were a very young person indeed.
Quite young.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
Now let's talk about how you got involved with the UFO phenomena. I understand that during your travels you may have had some unusual events that opened up your consciousness that to the reality that the full spectrum of what we call reality is much broader than what we imagine, just like the full spectrum of electromagnetic radiation is much broader than what our eyes can see. So tell us what happened during your travels that opened your consciousness.
Well, first of all, during my first journey, my first trip, I came across, there's these. It was the old hippie trail that ran from London all the way to New Delhi and Kathmandu, and you find secondhand bookstores all along the route, where people who were traveling like me would trade their books or just try and sell their books to get some weight off their backs. I came across a book by Erich von Däniken, well known, of course, and it was the first book, Chariots of the Gods, and I thought it was fascinating, and I still credit Mr. von Däniken with making a large number of the public aware of all kinds of anomalies in human history, pointing to mysterious and unexplainable phenomena or buildings and things around the world. And after the first book, I came across another book by him, and I bought that too. And in the end, I was traveling around with the pile of, I think, 6 or 7 of his volumes, all in pocket edition, of course. But I was fascinated by them.
As a former backpacker, I know that carrying any extra weight doesn't seem like much for 5 or 10 minutes, but when you're on your feet for 5 to 10 hours, those extra 2 or 3 pounds or 4 of books can really get heavy.
Yes, but the enlightenment of sorts that it gives is worth its weight in gold, I think. The limitation, I think, of Mr. van Däniken's work is that he seemed to have come up with his own cosmology, rather ignoring cosmologies such as that of Madame Blavatsky, who was one of the founders of the Theosophical Society in the late 19th century. And that's my background, as we're trying to get a picture of what started me on this route of writing about the extraterrestrial presence. The Ageless Wisdom teachings, as it's called, starting with Madame Blavatsky, with the Theosophical teachings, expanded on later by Alice Bailey, the British lady who later moved to America, wrote many volumes of esoteric literature. Helena Rerik, a Russian lady, the Agni Yoga books. Later, Benjamin Creme, recently deceased. So those are the books that I really studied, also from around 19, 20 years old. And those are the teachings that form my background. But to come back to your question, on one of my trips back to Nepal, maybe I think it was the third trip going there, I was in my usual spot at the foot of the Annapurna mountain range. It was early morning, and the mountain range, the Annapurna range, is snow-clad even in summer. Although the snow line will be higher up, of course, in summer. Well, this was winter. Yes, this was winter. We're above the equator. So there was a fair amount of snow, and it's a beautiful sight to see the sunrise with all the different shades and hues of purple turning into dark red, turning into orange, and gradually into yellow and golden. And from the mountain range, you turn your gaze to the sun, and which is possible in the early morning. And at one point, I saw the sun split itself, and there was a copper disk moving away from the copper disk, which I thought was rather odd.
So you're saying that the sun appeared to be two suns, or this object?
Eventually, yes. After one of the disks had moved away from the original disk that you see as the sun, and then suddenly there were two suns. And I thought, that's something I haven't seen before. I was there with a friend, and I pointed it out to my friend, and my friend was freaked out. He just freaked out. He said, "Hey, don't point out those kind of things to me. I can't handle that." And that reassured me that I actually saw what I saw. At the time, I must be, to be honest, I didn't even relate it to UFO activity. But years later, I think it was in the late 1990s or even a bit later, there came out reports. No, I think it was about 5 or 8 years ago, reports, and the first one I remember seeing was from Taiwan, where there was a report in the media of two suns showing in the sky. And by then, I had taken up a solid interest in extraterrestrial visitors and UFOs, etc. And it was then, I think, that I finally realized that I must have seen something probably out of this earth, out of this world at that time. Yes.
That's that kind of sighting that very dramatic can plant a seed. Yeah, even in the most skeptical, or shall we say the most fearful, as witness. And those seeds, because of the continued UFO activity and the response of many different communities, those seeds have grown. And in your case, They've grown into 3 books. Now that I've read most of your latest, I have to say that I'm going back to purchase the other 2. And I'm very curious about Adamski. And so tell us a little bit more about how you started your more academic investigations, because your work, by the way, is very well documented. I like the fact that the book is small, which means I can carry it around with me, and that every single statement is well referenced, so I can review the literature by reviewing the references to see how you came upon your theories. So tell us what piqued your interest in a more academic, really historical and political science analysis.
But just a slight correction. I've just last year published my 4th book, Before Disclosure, Dispelling the Fog of Speculation, which is actually sort of a philosophical approach to how I deal with the subject. But yes, what piqued my interest to the extent that I started to write about it was I told you that my background is that of, apart from my professional work, as a teacher, an educator, I've been a student of the Ageless Wisdom teachings for, since I was 19 or 20 years old. And I read and studied many of the books by the authors that I just mentioned, Blavatsky, Bailey, Cram. And my first major publication was an online publication, which is still around. It's an annotated catalogue, if you will, of those teachings. As I was building that catalogue, I came to the point where I wanted to include, the contactees that I thought, based on, for instance, Benjamin Cram's information, were valid to be included. And George Adamski had been mentioned by Cram in his very first book from 1979. So I had been, I've been reading Adamski's books, rereading, I should say, because I read his 2 main books, Flying Saucers Have Landed, which Adamski co-wrote with Desmond Leslie, and Inside the Spaceships from 1955, in which he elaborates on his many meetings and the teachings that he received from his space contacts. But I was looking into other publications by Adamski, and I found out more and more as I delved into his background. And of course, if you just Google George Adamski, a lot of lies and half-truths and just gossip and derision, ridicule comes up more than anything else.
In preparation for this conversation, earlier today, I looked at Wikipedia's review of George Adamski. So it may be interesting for the audience, some people who are not familiar, to say a few words about George Adamski, who, what I learned today, or relearned, was that he was born in 1891. As a young man, he served in the United States Army prior to U.S. involvement in the First World War. He reportedly served on the raids against Pancho Villa in northern Mexico. And so when he passed away in the 1960s, I think it was 1965, yeah. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, which I believe is, reserved for veterans.
Yes.
And during his years, he worked in many types of work. He was not an educated man in terms of formal education, and so he did odd jobs. And then later on, during the Depression, he got involved in a kind of New Age religion, and you can supplement my statements with your understanding of his journey. But at one point, and his critics made a very big point of this, that he, during the Prohibition period, was able to get permission from the federal government to manufacture wine because they use it in the religious ceremonies. And the Wikipedia story, and I say story because I have a feeling much of it is, if not made up, then at least highly distorted. They quoted him as saying something to the extent that the Depression was great. I was able to make wine and supply all of Southern California, and when the Prohibition period ended, I was sort of out of a job, and he made some allegedly a very derogatory comment. He said, if it hadn't been for the end of the Prohibition period, I wouldn't have had to gotten into this UFO junk.
Yes.
So these are the quotes. But so let's talk a little bit about his journey, because you have written a book, and a lot of people don't understand. And I have to say that I fell into this trap as well, that I did not understand the documentation, the extent of his communications, and the similarities between much of what he was saying and other contactees, and that it went beyond just a concern about nuclear arms race and nuclear testing, which, as our audience may know, back in the 1940s and the 1950s, the United States and the former Soviet Union were in a kind of race to develop weapons of mass destruction, and it involved something that to this day is still a problem. It involved atmospheric testing, where both sides dumped hundreds of millions of metric tons of radioactive fallout from these nuclear tests in the atmosphere all over the planet. And they did have very specific health consequences. So people were aware of the dangers of the nuclear arms race, and that information was reflected in the communications that the extraterrestrials, or whoever they were, because I'm somewhat dubious about the ET hypothesis, but whoever they were concerned about nuclear weapons. So tell us about that.
Yes, the quotes that you just cited from Wikipedia are a good example of the degree to which especially the authorities, and since then almost everyone else who wanted to be taken seriously in the field of ufology or the flying saucer phenomenon, or exopolitics as it's called, has been called since, I don't know, 2006, I believe. Anyone who thinks they want to make a name for themselves or wants to be taken seriously, they deride and ridicule, defame George Adamski. And it's usually not based on what he said himself. The quote that you gave about the Prohibition thing that he was involved in, I don't know what it is based on. And even if there's some degree of truth in that, it doesn't take away from the fact that he had the most remarkable life. My interest in George Adamski started, let me give some background as to the origin of the teachings I've been talking about and that form my background. Madame Blavatsky in the late 19th century founded with some others the Theosophical Society, which was set up to reintroduce to humanity the notion of the evolution of consciousness, the fact that out of the human kingdom has evolved a spiritual kingdom which is populated by what are called the masters of wisdom. Men like us, men and women like us, who have evolved beyond the strictly human state. And from their midst, through the centuries, through the ages, they have sent teachers into the world to remind humanity of our innate divinity, and pointed the way usually against, the cultural background of the area where they, at that time in human history, would be of where their teaching would be best received and was most necessary. So we're talking about people like Krishna and Buddha, Sankaracharya, Jesus, but also mythological people, teachers who have been relegated to mythology, Hermes, Hercules, many others. These masters of wisdom who have always been around on our planet as the guides and inspirators, the mentors of humanity, at the end of, during the final destruction of the continent of Atlantis, according to the wisdom teachings, they withdrew to the remote mountain and desert areas of the world. And many people will have heard of the masters of wisdom as they reside in valleys in Tibet, hidden valleys in Tibet or in the Andes. Some people claim there are some masters on Mount Shasta. And the interesting thing, when I started looking at George Adamski's work in depth, I then came across the title of his first book, which is called The Wisdom of the Masters of the Far East. Mm-hmm. This was 1936, long before any publication by him, or I believe anyone else, about flying saucers or extraterrestrial visitors. I managed to obtain a copy, and the content of this booklet, it's only a small booklet, was almost a one-on-one, but in his own words, reflection of the teachings that I had been studying, especially the books by Blavatsky and Bailey, Alice Bailey, and Benjamin Creme. It's remarkable, the degree and the insight and the enlightening quality of the text. I continued my research to find out more about Adamski, and I found several sources that hinted at Adamski having been sent to Tibet as a teenager. Apparently his father died as a young age. They were Polish immigrants, the Adamski family.
I believe he was born in the United States.
No, right? he was born in Poland.
Oh, and as a boy, he came here when he was 2 years old. That was it.
2 or 4 years old, and at a very young age, after they had landed in the U.S. and the family settled in Dunkirk, his father died at a young age. His father was a carpenter, by the way. And during their voyage across the ocean, and as young George would go to school in Dunkirk and come home, he would run into a person that he named Uncle Sid. So let's call him Uncle Sid.
Dunkirk was in New Jersey, is that right? Or was it close to New
I
York?
believe so, yes. Yeah. Dunkirk, New Jersey. And this Uncle Sid took on the paternal role, at least with regard to young George, and suggested to his mother and offered to pay for it, that to send George to a monastery in Tibet.
How old was George Adamski?
He was in his teens. I don't know if he was 14 or 15 or 16. I don't know. And
it sounds like you may have gone on a similar journey to the East. Not that much older.
Not that much older, but I didn't get as far as George Adamski did in terms of the people that he met and was trained and educated by. He was actually he ended up in a monastery in Tibet where he was taught and studied with one or several of the masters of wisdom.
Now this is quite remarkable, because I've read the book, I think it was 7 Years in Tibet, about which was made into a movie, I think with Brad Pitt, about these German prisoners of war during World War II and their desperate struggle to enter into the kingdom of Tibet on foot, and the challenges that they face in terms of the cold, the high altitudes, the basically they were moving through areas that were like deserts, and they finally came upon the kingdom where they were starving and exhausted, and they were taken in. So I find that really, and they also brought back, I think, the first photographs to the West of the Dalai Lama and of that region. At least that's what the people who promoted the book and movie said. I'm not sure that's true, but so for a man to go and receive the wisdom traditions at that time,
a boy,
that's a boy. Yeah, that's quite remarkable. How secure are you in the documentation about this journey? Because this is not mentioned readily in many of the reports that you see on the internet.
No. The sources were, the information I retrieved came from different sources, one of which was a newspaper article in the Los Angeles Examiner. I'm not sure I think it was 1934, in which Adamski was asked about his beginnings. And that's the only reference that I'm aware of that he gave himself to his training in Tibet. And he said that he learned a lot there on the roof of the world, especially in terms of controlling, our lower nature as human beings, temperature, body temperature, things like that. There was a source, Fred Steckling, the first president of the George Adamski Foundation, referred to it in one of his writings. There's a book by Henry Dohan, an Australian inventor, who wrote a book about the early contactees called The Pawn of His Creator, and he had a reference to it. And there's a rather rare book by Swiss author, longtime Adamski associate Lou Zinstag, co-written with renowned UK researcher Timothy Good. It's called George Adamski.
At Lowe's, we know that pros need to be ready. Ready to roll felt, ready to cap, ready to shingle. And during Lowe's Ready to Raise the Roof event, pro customers should get ready to save big with up to 20% on GAF shingles every day when they buy in bulk. Plus, now through July 16th at Lowe's, pros can save up to 20% off select Hitachi nailers, compressors, and power tools. See the Pro Desk in-store for details. Shingle offer applies to contractor packs. Selection varies by store, U.S. only.
The untold story, and Lou Zinstag refers to it as well.
So I'm going to play the role of devil's advocate here, because these are interesting references and people who were closely associated with him. But a man of Adamski's, shall we say, showmanship, because to be an educator, as you well know, to teach, you have to get people's attention, and in order to get them their attention, you have to sometimes play the role of a showman. So a man of his showmanship, I imagine with that very unusual part of his biography, under ordinary circumstances, one might assume that he would talk readily about that. And I'm questioning whether he actually went there physically because of the travels, the extreme difficulties in traveling to that remote part of the world. However, I don't necessarily think that he wasn't exposed to the teachings of Tibetan masters, but as we both know, in terms of parapsychology, out-of-body experiences, and telepathic communications, people have experiences where part of their consciousness travels to remote locations where they receive information. This is called sometimes remote viewing, or sometimes a separate subject, out-of-body experiences. So I'm not questioning necessarily that he received some kind of indoctrination as a young person, because many contactees receive vast amounts of philosophical information as young people, and even though they are not able to digest it or totally comprehend it, it influences their later activities. Now, do you think there's a possibility that he never actually went to Tibet, but that he was through consciousness trained? I'm just raising this as a question.
I appreciate that, and you're absolutely right in the sense that it is perfectly possible for people out of body to be taken somewhere or to go somewhere and receive information. And I believe, for instance, based on the confirmations information coming from Benjamin Graham, that Bert T. Spalding, famous author of Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East, first volume was published in 1924, that his story was based on out-of-body experiences.
Could you mention the author again? I didn't quite catch that. 1924.
Baird T. Spalding.
Oh, Baird T. Spalding. Okay.
Yes. And that's one example. And I, as you mentioned before, the journey to Tibet was very difficult, to say the least. It was an arduous journey in those days.
No airplanes, no good roads, no helicopters,
no trains.
We're talking about walking for very long periods of time in an area. Well, it wasn't like you could just stop off at McDonald's and have a hamburger and keep on walking.
Or even a roadside tea stall or something.
Right, you had
vast areas, uninhabited, and very, very hostile, often to human habitation. Yes.
Yes.
There are actually, however, examples of authors who have. Who were able to penetrate into Tibet. Several of Madame Blavatsky is one of them. There's a marvelous biography written by Sylvia Cranston. And if you talk about research, and referencing facts, that is a prime example. It's a very, very big biography, but hundreds and hundreds of pages, but it's a page turner. It's an absolute page turner, and I recommend it to anyone who wants to know more about Blavatsky's life and work and influence. But she was one who made it into Tibet, which was in the 19th century, as a rather young woman.
I remember that.
There's MacDonald Bain, a Scottish doctor, physician, divinator, if that's a word. He studied the divinities and he was a healer. And he made it into Tibet in 1938. And he spent months, if not a year, with the masters there to be trained and studied with them. And we have the case of Dr. Rolf Alexander, the author of, in the American edition is called Creative Realism. I think it was published in 1956. And he became known because of his mental cloud-busting techniques. And he also describes, no, he doesn't really describe it, he hints at and he gives some information in his early books, in the early editions of his books, about having traveled to Tibet and being taught there, the techniques that he then explained in his books. Rolf Alexander, by the way, is, I don't know if you've heard of him.
No, I have not.
The British edition of that book, Creative Realism, was called The Power of the Mind. And he was present at one point with General Marshall of the Marshall Plan fame, Second World War, when General Marshall told him, what was it again? I think it had to do with Roswell.
Oh, wow.
I'm not entirely sure anymore, but it was something to do with the extraterrestrial presence. So General Marshall was aware of that, and they discussed it with Rolf Alexander.
Well, this is very interesting because as our audience, the people who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s will remember, the Marshall Plan was an enormous project to rebuild Western Europe, which had been destroyed by the Second World War, in which perhaps 70 to 90 million people perished around the planet. And he was so powerful that I believe he actually was offered the position of Supreme Commander of United States Armed Forces, and he turned it down because his interests were to assist the president during the war years and not be the Supreme Commander. So he was very well connected, and that Marshall Plan was an enormous success. And so having a conversation between a contactee or a researcher of contactees and someone of that power is of significance. We're going to go to a break in about 15 minutes. I'd like to take care of some housekeeping. For those people who are just tuning in, I'm interviewing Gerard Aartsen. He's an author, lecturer, and he's studied the work of the esoteric masters as well as the New Age philosophies that have a resounding effect still on the UFO scene today. And we're going to be continuing our discussion, but first I'd like to tell you something about the hosting organization. We're talking about EPIC, the Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council, and this organization, founded by Mr. Ken Sherry, is sponsoring this radio show. He recruited me as a host and now program director. If you want to learn more about EPIC, you can go to our website, epicvoyagers.com. You can check out the Epic Voyagers on Facebook, and you can also visit the Epic Voyagers YouTube channel. So please visit us at epicvoyagers.com for up-to-date information on exciting programs and projects. From this website, you can link to our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and of course, subscribe to the YouTube page. You can also catch us live every Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern and 6 p.m. Pacific at InceptionRadioNetwork.com. IRN provides you with several opportunities to tune in and not miss a beat. This includes listening to us live on television set via Roku TV's set-top media player. You can download the IRN app on your Android, iPhone, BlackBerry, and Amazon smartphones, or through their syndicated streaming partners like TuneIn and iTunes and Google Play Music. The show is also available on your car stereo via Stitcher Radio's Vehicle Dashboard app. And lastly, even if your power goes out, you can listen to us through an old-fashioned tethered phone line by dialing 401-267-8300. That's 401-267-8300. The show is rebroadcast every Friday night on Dark Matter Digital Network at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. And if you absolutely can't catch us on the air, don't worry. You can catch the show as well as hundreds of other past Epic Voyages by visiting irnshows.com. We invite you to join our conversation through the IRN chat phone, and that is listed on the website. So now that I've taken care of some housekeeping, in the next 10 minutes or so, let's explore how this New Age philosophy has had an impact on modern ufology. And this is something that I find fascinating because in my mid-40s, I had no knowledge, or I should say early 40s, I had no knowledge about these subjects, and I was recruited into a UFO contact team by Dr. Stephen Greer, and all of a sudden I found myself meditating, taking hikes in the remote regions of the high desert looking for research sites to try to attack UFOs. And I heard the names of Adamski and the founder of Theosophy. Her name was Madame, how do you say the name?
Blavatsky.
Blavatsky. And so the information, this sort of Eastern mystical influence, has had an impact on Western society, well, even in the post-World War II and hippie day era, where many people, the Beatles, for example, studied Eastern philosophy, meditation. There was a definite influence on their music with the great sitar player Ravi Shankar. So there have been, during the last 120 years, there has been wave after wave of Eastern mystical teachings breaking through the walls, the fortress of Western materialism, and giving enlightenment to people. And so I found myself meditating and studying the works of the people that we're discussing, even so briefly, but knowing that there was this Eastern influence, which I appreciated very much.
Yes, you mentioned, you call it mystical teachings. I think if you would read the works by Blavatsky and Alice Bailey and Benjamin Creme, you would find little mysticism in it. There's many people who follow them or took parts of their teachings, their books, and developed their own approach to it, most of which I would call mystical. But the original teachings, the original books, are very practical. Mysticism doesn't, especially to the Western mind, doesn't ring a practical bell. But the teachings that we're discussing here, that I've been studying, that Adamski studied on, during his time in Tibet, are really very practical. They help you accomplish things. They help you control your lower nature. They help you deal with everyday life in a way that would otherwise be, perhaps too stressful or would lead to burnout. And I'm not saying that, you're guaranteed a lifetime without burnout if you read these teachings, but the secret is in applying the teachings. I mean, you can read a library full of genuine books, but without application in your daily life, nothing will happen. So they should be seen as very practical books. Now, when I
let's talk a little bit about mysticism, because that word is thrown around a lot. My understanding as mysticism involves acquisition of knowledge that doesn't necessarily come from a book or studying in the library or attending a lecture. Mysticism is knowledge or information that's acquired through intuition, through interactions with perhaps non-human intelligences who directly transmit their teachings into the consciousness of the experiencer. Could you talk about what mysticism means to you? Because I suspect a lot of people in the audience, like me, throw the word around a lot, but don't necessarily have a good feel for what it involves.
Yeah. Well, for me, personally, a mystic is someone who's involved in finding out more about their own reality and trying to penetrate the realms of consciousness that go beyond our day-to-day consciousness. And they're not necessarily the most practical people. Mystics, in my mind, you find in monasteries, on mountaintops, or the bottom of trees, underneath trees. The people, introverted people, they look, and there's nothing wrong with being introvert. I'm an introvert myself. But what is important to me is that mysticism isn't of much use in our current world. The world is screaming for our active involvement. We cannot save the world by turning inward and building our own inner world without applying, as I just mentioned, any of that in our daily lives. If we understand that peace comes from within, from an inner transformation, then we have to show that, make that practical in our daily lives. And once we do that, we're not mystical anymore. Then we're turning it outward. What we've learned inwardly, we turn outward. We give it into the world. We show it. We give the right example. We teach by example. We don't try to ram things down people's throats, but we show them through our example how we deal with certain situations, with political opponents, with all kinds of situations that other people might storm in and start using their fists or shouting or running away from, and so for me the importance is in that distinction between the mystic who is learning about themselves in the best cases, and the practical mystic, let's call the person who has attained a certain insights in themselves and in the inner reality of life, but applying that in daily life.
Well, this is a very moral position that you're describing, and my background was very different, and I grew up in the political left, Marxist, and no attention whatsoever to these issues. And as I became more mature and I realized the terrible damage that communism has done all around the world, even though people in my family were part of those movements. I was never a member of the Communist Party, but there were people in my family who were. And I realized that the major failing of the Soviet state and the entire philosophy of Marxism was that it completely abandoned the wisdom traditions and religions that had given us some very practical instructions about living. And basically, the Marxists lived in a world in their heads, dreaming of this classless society. But when it came to actual action, they committed all kinds of crimes and atrocities. And so, when I reached my 40s, and the former Soviet Union fell apart as was destined to do, because it was really rotting from the inside. I had traveled to Russia in the 80s and saw, that people over there, they talked about Marxism, but no one actually understood it because it was all corrupt. It was all power politics. And so I turned inward, and when I joined the contact movement, I started meditating, and I had spiritual experiences and acquired spiritual knowledge, as well as communication with extraterrestrials. So I have to say that I'm very sympathetic to the writings of these pioneers that trying to bring ancient knowledge into our culture, because there is something very important going on here. And for me personally, it was very exciting to make contact with non-human intelligence, but also in order to facilitate those communications, I had to go inside and learn more about myself. And recently I came up with a statement that describes my journey by saying the following: we must look inside to experience transformation in the formless realm and become the person we want to see, become the change we want to see in the world. So we have to look inside to experience transformation, to become the become the change we want to see in the world. And we look outside in the world of form, not the formless realm of consciousness, but the world of form, to find kindred activist souls to actually change the external world. So this dynamic between internal discovery, enlightenment, spiritual journey, and then taking that knowledge and applying it to the big picture is the way that we can make the radical reforms necessary in order to preserve our civilization. So I very much, although I was trained as a materialist and I was a medical doctor for 40 years, I still have a license. I just basically treat family and friends and give out free medical advice and keep my license going, so I can write prescriptions for myself and my wife, who live in a kind of remote area in Northern California. Doctors get to write prescriptions for themselves, not controlled substances, but and so I keep my doctor work going, and I found these teachings not only helpful in terms of my philosophical, but these teachings also helped me to become a better physician too. And I had mystical experiences, or actually involved in my medical work, where I was given information and directed to do certain things. In retrospect, I couldn't understand what had happened, why I went to a patient's room to check on a lab test that was totally normal, and then there was a woman who was the roommate of the patient who I had gone to see, who right in front of me had a cardiac arrest, and I was able to resuscitate her with a precordial thumb. So I felt that because of of my inner journey, I had acquired certain psi-tech skills that allowed me to help my patients. So we're going to go to a break now in just a few seconds. Just to remind the audience, you're listening to Epic Voyages. Please stay tuned. The commercial break will last several minutes, and we'll be back with our guest, Gerard Aartsen, talking about the philosophy and activities of the early contactees. My name is Dr. Joseph Burkes. Stay tuned. Good evening. Thank you for staying online. For those people who are just tuning in, you're listening to Epic Voyages on the Inception Radio Network. My name is Dr. Joseph Burkes. I'm your host tonight. And we have with us, all the way from Holland, Mr. Gerard Aartsen, who is an author, a lecturer, as well as an instructor in English for secondary school teachers in his native Holland. We're talking about the experiences of the contactees from the 1950s, the theosophy and the New Age philosophies that have such an impact to this day on what is called ufology. Gerard, are you still with us?
Hello, Joseph. Yes, I'm still here.
Oh, great. Okay. So let's continue our dialogue. I had mentioned just before the break that I came from a left-wing background. We were, I wouldn't say atheists, but highly agnostic. We'd make the joke in our family, an agnostic is an atheist who's not quite sure there is no God, and then we would pray to our atheist God in atheist heaven when things were really troubling us. So let's talk a little bit about Karl Marx, because you've just shared with me a fascinating statement which I had never heard, that Marx, according to some of these esoteric authors and channels and masters, was a disciple of Jesus. Is that correct?
This is coming from Benjamin Creme, who worked with a Master of the Wisdom since 1959. When you segued into your left-wing background, and I consider myself of a left-wing background, I was very much a social activist in my days in secondary school, and I was not at all looking for enlightenment when I first went to India. But remarkably, if I can just share this, about 6 months after my return from India, I woke up. I was still living with my parents. I was, I was working in a paper mill to earn money for my next journey, my next trip. I was living with my parents, and one morning in August 1978, I woke up with the total, absolute conviction, knowledge, certainty that the Christ was back in the world. I was raised a Catholic, fair enough, but since my 14th, since I was 14, I never went back to church because my voice had broken and I couldn't sing in the boys' choir anymore. And church had lost its appeal.
The thrill was gone, as they say.
Exactly. Yes. I was interested in social activism, looking for solutions to social injustice. In most of the time, left-wing parties, but I explored, everything from the right to the left, and there I was waking up with this solid knowledge. Christ is back in the world, and I had no recollection of a dream, not of a vision, nothing whatsoever. I just couldn't explain it, and I was filled to the brim with joy. I just could not explain it. I was beyond myself with joy, and I had no idea where it came from. And it wasn't until 2 months later I read an interview in a New Age magazine, first interview outside the UK with Benjamin Creme, who was the first time I heard of him. And
he was from Britain, right?
Yes, he was in London at the time. He lived in London. He's lived in London since 1946, I believe. He's a well-known artist. but he became better known through his work, as an esotericist and futurologist, a writer, speaker about his mission. And in his interview, he explained what was going on in the world. He updated the information from Alice Bailey in the 19 books that she'd written for her master between 1919 and 1949. And Benjamin Graham announced that he had been asked to inform the world that the Christ was coming back, not as a religious figure, not as someone that people should turn to as a creator or as a god, but as a teacher. A teacher, especially in terms of social justice, but also in terms of, the art of self-realization, etc. And maybe we can talk about that a bit more later. And in one of his many books since then, Benjamin Graham has shared the information that the social justice movements like the labor movement and the suffragette movement, equal rights movement, were inspired by the Master Jesus. Most people will know the name Jesus as the individual of being Jesus Christ in the New Testament. But in fact, according to the teachings, Jesus was a disciple of the Christ being the Christian title. A more generic title would be the world teacher, who worked by it's not channeling, but it's telepathic overshadowing of the consciousness of the greater consciousness, by the greater consciousness of a smaller consciousness. In this case, the disciple Jesus, between the baptism in the River Jordan and the crucifixion. That's when Jesus became the vehicle for the Christ, if you will. This is all according to the Ageless Wisdom teachings. It's very similar to how Prince Gautama became the vehicle for the Buddha from the moment of his enlightenment underneath the Bodhi tree. And that's when he started his mission teaching Buddhism, what became Buddhism.
Yeah. This dual consciousness of the great teachers is something that I've run across in terms of the work of Joe McGonigal. You perhaps are familiar with, he was a sergeant in the U.S. military and became a champion remote viewer. And one of the books he wrote it was called The Ultimate Time Machine, in which he described future Earth civilization in the year 3000. But I believe as part of that book, although it might have been Mind Trek, his earlier work, he was given to remote view an individual. And the way the remote viewing protocols worked is information would be put in a vault. There was no way that he would be able to actually visualize with his eyes what the target was, but he would use his psychic ability to do so. So what we see is psychics being given the task. In this case, it was Joe McGonigal, who was a champion remote viewer, worked for the United States Intelligence Services and Project Stargate. He was given the target to remote view Jesus of Nazareth. And
at Lowe's, we know that pros need to be ready. Ready to roll felt, ready to cap, ready to shingle. And during Lowe's Ready to Raise the Roof event, pro customers should get ready to save big with up to 20% on GAF shingles every day when they buy in bulk. Plus, now through July 16th at Lowe's, pros can save up to 20% off select Hitachi nailers, compressors, and power tools. See the Pro Desk in store for details. Shingle offer applies to contractor packs. Selection varies by store, U.S. only.
He, of course, was not told this was the target. The information was locked in a vault. And what he described was a being that had a dual aspect. That on one hand, it was an ordinary individual, a human being. But on the other hand, there was this other consciousness that was, shall we say, celestial in nature, and was transmitting to Jesus the information and knowledge that he needed. So this dual aspect of the consciousness of great teachers is something that, in terms of Joe McGonigal's remote viewing experiences, is corroborated. And then he went on to remote view others as well, and he described for the Buddha, I believe, and other historical religious figures, this dual aspect aspect of consciousness. And one of the things that was so impressive was the being that was celestial in nature had a sense of humor and was very joyous. And so when you describe this sense of joy, that when you had a realization that Christ was back, I think that there is this element to Christ consciousness or spiritual development that can bring out just tremendous joy in people, because it allows us to basically transcend our individuality and become part of basically all that there is.
Yes, well, I think you put that's a very accurate way of putting it. And that, I think, is also the essence of the evolution of consciousness, which is really the path of return that every single human being is engaged in. Some people have been traveling the path longer than others, so they've come closer. And in this case, like the example I was describing, a disciple like Jesus was almost there in terms of his individual point of evolution, where he could be overshadowed by an entity such as the world teacher, the Christ. And since his mission in Palestine, Jesus, in his next incarnation as Apollonius of Tyana, became a master in his own right. So since then, I don't know how, maybe within 100 years after his death on the cross in Israel, Palestine, sorry, he became a master. And some of the masters move on to higher planets, higher systems, for to evolve beyond things that we cannot even imagine. But many of the masters stay on Earth to help humanity oversee our evolution, to inspire us. And so the Master Jesus is very much involved with humanity, and inspired not only the social justice movements of the late 19th, early 20th century, but Karl Marx, according to the information coming from Benjamin Graham's master, was a disciple of the Master Jesus. I think so, and that's why, if I may, when you said before the break that I was taking a moral position, I was thinking Karl Marx took a very moral position in not accepting, the inequality in society, and setting out a system for social justice, even if his followers failed, in the most part, to put it into practice. But the same can be said for almost all of the religious teachings. Not many of the religious teachings from the teachers. I'm not talking about the dogma, because the dogma came in when people try to perpetuate the teachings, and then power play came into play, and the power structures, and that's where we go wrong.
Religion is used as an instrument of power, rather than as a path for spiritual development and creating an enlightened, just society. It reminds me of the expression that I learned when I joined the Contact Network, and that was that God gave humanity spirituality, and then the devil organized it as religion.
It's an old joke, actually, that goes back to Gerard Aartsen, who came out of the Theosophical Society. And I was just thinking of him before the break. I forget what triggered it, but Gerard Krishnamurti talked about the only real revolution that can take place is inside ourselves. And once we have realized that what we do in the world has an effect, then we should try to the best of our ability to work towards right human relations and put into practice what we realize inwardly. And of course, this ties in directly with the need for social justice and the message of the contactees that the early contactees were given, because that's just stunning. You say you've been reading my book Priorities for a Planet in Transition, and yes. When I go back to it, I still can't believe the amount of information, the degree of accuracy to which they describe the current situation in the world. You know, that's
right. I was very impressed because they didn't just talk about the nuclear arms race, which was, a terrible crime against humanity, not only in terms of detonating nuclear weapons and children. I was just a child when I was growing up in the 1950s, and there was strontium-90 being deposited in the deciduous teeth of children from these nuclear tests. I'm not talking about Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. The Russians at one point detonated a nuclear weapon in the 1960s that was, I believe, 62 megatons in Siberia, 62 million tons of TNT equivalent. It was something like 2,000 times the strength of, or more. It was more like 20,000 times the strength of the original nuclear bombs that went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so people were very much concerned, including the original contactees like Obdansky and Donald Fry. But in the writings that I were able to review in your book, the one that you mentioned, which I'm still reading, and I find it very interesting. They also addressed ecology. They addressed the need for social justice in terms of ending the extremes of wealth. Those issues could be taken from the headlines of modern politics, and so that broad vision was something I was not aware of, and partly because of the inaccurate information. I think you used the word slander, but certainly inaccurate information about the early contactees. So let's talk about some of their specific statements or how they addressed these many issues before they became prominent.
Yes, please. Well, for them it wasn't quite as urgent in the 1950s, the question of social justice, social injustice, if you will. The inequality that we see in the world today wasn't quite as obvious as it is today, where individuals have been made to compete in order to make a living. Yes. There's so many people now, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who need 2 or 3 jobs just to be able to afford the minimum, the bare minimum of house rent and food, etc. And many people with a job have found themselves homeless. Mm-hmm. It's a cutthroat system that works. It's based on competition and greed. And through my study of the information and the teachings from the visitors, you say you're not quite sure about the ET hypothesis. For me, that's not a question. But in any case, their teachings and their information show a tremendous insight, as early as the 1950s, into what causes our problems. And if you go to the heart of it, to the heart of the problem, it's our sense of separation.
Right.
That sense of separation of you are you and me is me, and I have to look after number one, or else I might lose out in our competition for survival. That is what's causing the enormous danger that we find ourselves in today. The competition and the greed that are the constituents, the building blocks of our society, are tearing the world apart, are creating ever more tension and conflict and chaos, to the point where we now find ourselves with a billionaire as the president of the United States, claiming to speak for the people, whereas the people are left behind. The wealthy are parading their wealth before the eyes of the poor, as the world teacher has been saying in one of his messages, and it's just atrocious. We've been, humanity has held very high aspirations, which came together in the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was ratified, I believe, in 1948 by all the then members of the United Nations. And
I was very impressed that you included that information in the book, because a lot of people in the United States don't know about the Economic Bill of Rights, and I was active in Bernie Sanders' campaign, and we supported him politically and financially in that failed campaign for the presidency. Nevertheless, those teachings that we're talking about, social justice, that is part of all the wisdom traditions, that struggle for peace and justice is still going on today. And that's why I was very happy to see that you included the Economic Bill of Rights as integrated into the thinking and the experience of people living around the time of when these contactees, Adamski and Donald Fry and all the others, were active spreading the message, the good news, as you would say. If it's a secular religion, then spreading the gospel. And one of the things that impressed me as part of the left was that it really was a secular religion. There was no scientific reason to believe that the working class would be empowered through a historical necessity to overthrow the capitalists and create a world of abundance. It was totally a pseudoscience. That's what's called scientific socialism. And in fact, it did incorporate many Christian principles into their philosophy and their goals. And one academic who studied Marxism I listened to, he made the remark that Marxism was the last of the great 19th century Christian heresies. And heresies meaning religious movements that broke off from Christianity and then were turned on or were turned upon by the main faith. So thinking of Marx as a Christian heretic because he wanted to create a society where the foundations of kindness would be laid, where people would work and they would contribute from their abilities, and they would receive not on the basis of their work, but on their basis of needs. From each according to his ability to each according to his needs, is a basic Christian concept of charity.
Yes. It's a basic Christian concept. It's a basic humanitarian concept. It's a basic socialist concept. It's basic to every major school of thought and human thinking. It's basic to the information coming from the contactees, and that's why I think it's important really to take it away from all the isms that we know, because it's really about who we are as human beings. Every human being, and I think it's even in a quote from one of those early contactees, has the same basic needs. When you think about it, whether you voted for Bernie Sanders or voted for Donald Trump, every human being, your children, your grandchildren, will have the same basic needs of adequate food, shelter, healthcare, and education. It's no different whether you're black or white, whether you're in the United States or in Nigeria or in China or in Peru. Everyone around the world has those basic needs. The beauty of this planet is, whether you believe it was created by a god or whether it came into existence by some cosmic accident, the beauty of this planet is that it has an abundance of resources to fulfill everybody's needs. All it takes is that we stop seeing each other as each other's competitors, and once we collaborate, once we cooperate to make available the abundance of resources in food and raw materials and technology, know-how, medical knowledge, everything, the first thing we will notice is that it will create trust. It will solve our complete focus on material matters, material things, rushes, competition for jobs, etc. Once we do that, there will be so much, peace of mind in a way. And it has nothing basically to do with religion. We can call it a religion if we go back to the origin of the term, religare, reconnect with who we really are, reconnect with our inner divinity. You know, when I'm speaking from my background as a student of the wisdom teachings, and you know what the world teacher has been referring to in his teachings, the masters are referring to in the teachings that they have given through Blavatsky and Bailey and the others. So you know, it's not really to do with whether you're a Marxist or a Christian or a Buddhist or whatever. It's whether we recognize that we are human beings, and whether we recognize that as human beings we are the other. There is no separation, there is no division, only the divisions that we implement.
For sure.
And
I was active in the Baha'i faith for 10 years. I'm no longer a member of that religious community, but the Baha'i faith is an independent religion that was started in Persia in the 19th century. And one of the slogans of the Baha'i cause, which wants to spread world peace and social justice, one of the important slogans that they have is one planet, one people. And in the contact movement, I worked initially with Dr. Greer and C. SETI, and then went on to work with independent groups. After I left that organization in 1997, worked with Peruvians. We've expanded that slogan from one planet, one people to one universe, one people. So ultimately, what drives me to be a team leader back in the 1990s of a contact team, and then later on working with Rama, Peruvian contactees in the year 2000, and now trying to work with contact activists to bring in political themes into the UFO field. You know, it's all being driven by that sense of brotherhood and sisterhood made large. One planet, one people, one universe, one people. Yes. And so these spiritual themes, religious themes that you describe in your book that came out from these early contactees, you know, resonates very powerfully with me. And one of the things that I felt very distressed about was the way in which the Marxists derided other faiths, because they said they're scientists and they're scientific socialism, and religion is the opiate of the working class, and yet their own philosophy was basically a secularized religion that incorporated many of those themes. Yeah. So I wanted to share that with you. We're going to take a slight housekeeping break, because I want the listeners to know that this program is sponsored by EPIC, which is the Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council. And to learn more about us, the following links are helpful. That's www.epicvoyagers.com. You can visit us at the Epic Voyagers page on Facebook, and also visit our YouTube channel. Please stay tuned for all future shows. We broadcast every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. That's Epic Voyages on the InceptionRadioNetwork.com. You can listen in. Also, IRN provides you with several opportunities to catch this show and other interesting presentations. You can do it on your television set by a Roku TV set-top media player. You can download the IRN app on your Android, iPhone, and BlackBerry and Amazon smartphone, or through their syndicated streaming partners like TuneIn, iTunes, Google Play Music. This show is also available on your car stereo via Stitcher Radio's Vehicle Dashboard app. And lastly, even if your power goes out, and you can listen to us through an old-fashioned tethered phone line by dialing 501-267-8300. That's 501-267-8300. The show is broadcast every Friday night on Dark Matter Digital Network at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. If you absolutely can't catch us on the air, don't worry. You can catch this show as well as hundreds of past Epic Voyages by visiting irnshows.com. So let's continue with our discussion. My name is Dr. Joseph Burkes. I'm an internal medicine physician, and you're a host for tonight's presentation. I have with me, thanks to the wonders of modern electronics and Skype, with us Gerard Aartsen, who is a teacher, a lecturer and author, and we're talking about the influences of the Theosophical movement as well as the early contactees, talking about issues of social justice, peace, and the need to control unsafe technologies, whether it be nuclear or in this case, the environmental effects of the fossil fuel industries that's causing global warming, or at least contributing to world climate change. It may not be the only cause. So let's talk more about the philosophy of Adamski and his friends. Many of them were not well educated, although I think Donald Fry had a degree in engineering. He was stationed at White Sands Test Range, which has historical significance in terms of UFOs. But the majority of them were of modest education, and now I'm very encouraged to see that people are active in the contact network, so-called contactees. I think of us as contact activists and contact workers, because the contactee, the E ending usually infers a kind of passive role like payee, contactee, employee, and in German and English the ER or OR endings are more active, worker, Arbeiter, actor. So the E ending is a kind of passive thing. The contactee is getting information. I think of us as contact activists because, let's face it, doing radio shows or going out into the field in vector and spacecraft, as we attempted to do back in the 90s, this is a lot of work. And so I think of myself not as a contactee, more as a contact activist. So let's get into that philosophy again and bring it up to date as well, because until I read your book, I was not aware of Benjamin Creme. So let's talk about him a little more, because that was much of your work in terms of, I think you served as an editor for his newsletter. Is that correct?
Well, I contribute to the Dutch edition of the monthly magazine that's been published since 1982, and that Benjamin Creme was the chief editor of until his passing last October. Sorry, what was the question? Oh,
okay, so the question is, we talked about Adamski in the 1950s, and now we're talking about Benjamin Creme.
Yes.
Creme, who, in many ways, his writings are even more up to date and more political and easier to access for people who live now in the 21st century.
Definitely. Yes. See, Adamski and Daniel Fry and Truman Bethune and Buck Nelson, these people, they were definitely activists. They put themselves out there against especially when the disinformation campaign started, against people's so-called better knowledge, saying that they had been contacted by people from outer space. And they were steadfast. They didn't waver, even though they were intimidated. They were offered checks for thousands of dollars. They were activists, really. So I agree.
In other words, bribes were offered to them to shut them up or denounce what they had said previously.
Yes.
And being people of humble background, they weren't like an emergency room physician like, say, Dr. Greer or myself, who back in the 1990s we were making between $150,000 and $200,000 a year. We had means, but these people from the contactees, activists from the 1950s, would be more susceptible to, shall we say, bribes, because they were of humble background.
Exactly. Yes, and maybe it's good to point out that this rumor, this gossip about Adamski having been running a moonshining operation because he had permission ostensibly, but if that had been the case during the Prohibition time, he would have been very, very rich. And he wasn't. I mean, everything shows that he wasn't rich. He didn't have money. So maybe that helps to put that into the category of rumors and gossip, with the intention that we now know it had, namely to deride and defame these people. Benjamin Graham was a contactee actually before. I mentioned that he had been working with a Master of Wisdom since 1959, but before that, in the 1950s, he was a contactee himself. He was in contact with some people from space, according to what he wrote in the introduction to his first book in 1979. And he was giving talks about the spiritual mission of the space visitors in the 1950s. But he even mentioned in a book from 2010, The Gathering of the Forces of Light, where he deals with the extraterrestrial presence from this esoteric point of view, with his background and his knowledge and his contact, especially with his Master of Wisdom. He mentions that he briefly worked with Adamski in a group in the 1950s that didn't meet in person but out of the body. And of course, there's no way we can check
on the accuracy of that. But we do know from the modern parapsychological literature that people do have encounters out of body, and this is a psychic phenomena that is robust. And so the claims back then were more suspect, perhaps because modern parapsychology was not established as not as firmly as it is today. Although today it's still an uphill battle for parapsychology to be accepted as a science.
Absolutely, yes. Nevertheless, Benjamin Graham has been working since 74 actually, but it was before he published his first book. But since 1974, he's been lecturing, first in the United Kingdom, in London. Since 1978, he started to venture out into Europe, Holland and Belgium first, by invitation, talking about the return into the world of the world teacher for the new coming age, new cosmic cycle. Just as teachers have come previously, historically, to inaugurate a new cycle. Jesus came to inaugurate the cycle, the age of Pisces, and if you look back at the in the zodiac, the various ages are similar. Especially, we still find symbols of those ages. The age of Taurus, for instance, with the golden calf that went against Moses' instructions on the stone tablets. The age of the ram, I believe, with Mithras, the Egyptian teacher, etc. And according to the teachings, the coming age will be the age of Aquarius. And it is important, and Graham has always pointed that out, it is nothing whatsoever to do with a new religion. Religions are formed by people, not by the teachers who come. Except this time it will be different because we now have global communication, we have global transportation, we have global connection. So everybody will be able to hear the teacher's words directly, individually, without need for interpreters. So this time there will not necessarily be a new religion, although people because they are in different stages of evolution, of development, some people will need a form of religion. And it's also not to do with doing away with religions, but religions, the existing religions, will be purified and eventually will be amalgamated into a world religion, according to the master who worked through Alice Bailey. But I think
interrupt you for a moment, because I'd like to bring up again Joe McGonigal and his book, The Ultimate Time Machine.
At Lowe's, we know that pros need to be ready. Ready to roll felt, ready to cap, ready to shingle. And during Lowe's Ready to Raise the Roof event, pro customers should get ready to save big with up to 20% on GAF shingles every day when they buy in bulk. Plus, now through July 16th at Lowe's, pros can save up to 20% off select Hitachi nailers, compressors, and power tools. See the Pro Desk in store for details. Shingle offer applies to contractor packs. Selection varies by store, U.S. only.
Where he remote viewed what a possible future, the year 3000. And one of the interesting characteristics of that future civilization, or at least potential future civilization, was that although there were three major religions, Islam, Christianity, and the Hinduism, that they had really come together quite a bit in terms of their teachings and their philosophy, and the distinctions were blurred in the future. And I think religions coming together is very important, because they were created initially by the disciples of great teachers to create a world of peace and cooperation. And right now, the major faiths are all over the world are the background for sectarian and political violence. And so
extremism, yes.
Extremism. So, I think that the faiths coming together and the work of the Catholic Church in terms of recent statements from the Vatican about the importance of Islam and the willingness to dialogue, these are all very important developments so that we can achieve one planet, one people, and on the basis of that collective unity, go out and meet potential visitors from the stars or other dimensions, whichever the case might be. So I think there is a religious impulse that's associated with the UFO community. I, as a former Marxist, understand the objections, to religion, but as someone who has seen the suffering that Marxism and materialism has done to the world, I see a strong need for spiritual renovation and for the religions to fulfill their true potential to bring heaven on earth through peace and cooperation.
Well, let's not forget that it's not just Marxism that brought suffering to humanity. Look at what capitalism is doing, not only to our Western societies, but also to the planet and our ecology and our own habitat, the only planet that we have. Capitalism is selling out, it's plundering and pillaging the planet. It's pillaging human capital, human health, human lives.
Yes.
It's sacrificing human lives on the altar of competition and greed. So, it has been every human attempt at building a society that we now see has failed, because we have always done it on the basis of exclusivity. And it's interesting that you brought up that point of the faiths coming together, because if you look at the heart of the major religions, and I mean all of the major religions, not just the main three, but all of them, we see that all of them have social justice at their core. In the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you, if you would have do them to you. But interestingly, all of the major religions also share the notion of a returning teacher. The Christians are waiting for the second coming. Buddhists are waiting for the fifth Buddha, who was
Islam. They're waiting for the 12th Imam to come.
The 12th Mahdi, 12th Imam. The Hindus are waiting for the 10th incarnation of Vishnu. So that's another point where they coincide. And this spiritual sentiment of waiting for the return of the Master is incorporated in the faith that I was part of for 10 years, the Baha'i faith, in which they talk about progressive revelation, that in every historic period there comes a great teacher, usually with a book of teachings, and a new faith is created to address the spiritual and ultimately the material needs of that evolving civilization. And that, according to the Baha'is, this is endless, that progressive revelation will never stop, and it will include women as well as men who will be remembered. Clearly women have been teachers. The first teacher that we all have, after all, is our mother. And so indeed. Women are going to play a very active role, and I suspect if there is a great teacher that emerges in our era, she will be a woman.
And I look forward to that.
The world teacher, who, according to Benjamin Graham, is in a male body at this time, and that's to do with the energetic balance of the planet. According to the wisdom teachings, the first masters who will take a female body will be in about 600 years. But the world teacher, whose personal name was already given by Gautama Buddha, and the personal name is Maitreya, has said that this coming age that he's coming to inaugurate will be the age of the mother. So there you go, and and it's not a coincidence that the suffragette movement for equal rights between men and women was also inspired by one of the masters.
Yes.
But to come back to these similarities in the religions, all of the religions, and it ties in with what you said about the Baha'i faith, about the ongoing revelation, the never-ending revelation. All of the religions also, or at least 5 of the major religions, also recognize or have the same notion of the evolution of consciousness. And of course, this evolution of consciousness, it goes on. The human kingdom has evolved out of the animal kingdom. The animal kingdom has come out of the vegetable kingdom, which has come out of the mineral kingdom. And the human kingdom is not the end of it. It's not the end of the line for evolution. It is a clearinghouse in terms of consciousness. And from the human kingdom have evolved, as I mentioned, the spiritual kingdom. And it goes on and on and on to levels of consciousness that we cannot begin to imagine, of which the masters and the world teacher and the historical teachers are mere examples for us to aspire towards. And this time in human history is so important because, and it's not just about the fates, but it's about putting into practice the fact that we know. Most people are aware inwardly that we are one. On the cover of my second book, Here to Help, UFOs and the Space Brothers, I summarize the message that I gathered from the information from the space people. Life is one, so live as one or perish. And that's the message that we were given, not only through the contactees, but also through the masters. And the polarization that is going on now will show us, without a doubt, the way forward. At least a large enough critical mass of humanity to make the right choice forward when our systems crash and crumble, which will happen any day now.
I'm not so sure about any day now, because I think in terms of history, it's a relatively short period of time that's going to pass when the combined effects of global warming and climate change will stress the food supply for tens or even hundreds of millions of people. It's been estimated in Bangladesh, where tens of millions of very poor farmers grow rice just a few feet above sea level. Their crops will be destroyed and their farms will be underwater, it's anticipated, and there will be no way that the world can feed 60 to 100 million people who live in Bangladesh. So we're looking at
I think the world has a surplus of food, except it's being stored for profit motives. It's not being distributed. And sadly, the current situation is so that the financial powerhouses and the stock markets dictate where money goes or where products go. And I think with the current unstable political situation in the world, and perhaps we should be thankful that Mr. Trump's election to the highest office of the United States will contribute to a situation internationally where the stock markets will fail, and so this whole house of cards will come crashing down. And when that happens, this is according to the information from Benjamin Graham, it will show humanity, or it will force humanity to make this choice. And at that time, the world teacher again, according to Benjamin Graham, will step forward. The teacher has been in the world, ready to preparing the world and humanity, but ready to announce himself since 1977. And when we get to that point, he will finally be able to announce himself, make himself known to humanity. And because of the current polarization, humanity will see what choice to make. And in order for humanity and the civilization, for the human race to survive and for civilization to progress safely, we will have to get away from the old ways of competition and greed, competing for profit, destroying the planet. There's only one way forward, only one realistic and viable way forward. That's through international cooperation, sharing the resources of the world, and creating justice and freedom for everyone, not just for the people who are rich and who can afford to buy their way into their freedom, which is not real freedom, of course. If my freedom depends on your lack of freedom, then we have a dependency situation, and I'm not free, because I wouldn't have this freedom unless you're not free. So freedom is universal and justice is universal, or it doesn't exist. And we now live in a world where neither exists. And it will soon come, I believe that, and it's the information coming from Benjamin Graham. But I think also the world situation shows that we're in the latter days of this civilization. We're going at a higher turn of the spiral through the latter days of Rome. And these are very interesting times to be alive, to be an incarnation.
Yes, they are very interesting times to be alive. And I think it's not only planetary unity that's a precondition for direct relations with whatever the source of the intelligence associated with the UFO phenomena, but it also has to be world unity that's peaceful and is, as you have described, based on social justice, not world unity based on domination and the rule of the few.
May I make one point?
We just have a last 2 minutes of our show, so let's have you make your final statements, and then we can go to our outro and share with our audience our closing thoughts now.
Thank you. I think what we need to remember is that unity does not equal uniformity. Many people spurn unity because they're afraid of uniformity. But unity can only be valid and valuable through diversity. If everyone contributes their individual talents and viewpoints to the whole, and when everyone is allowed to do that, we can have real unity. And unity is not only strength in numbers, but strength also in diversity of talents.
Right. Unity and strength through celebration of diversity is a wonderful slogan. And I'm going to say good night to you. We've been talking with Gerard Aartsen, lecturer, author, and also who speaks, by the way, speak English amazingly well, and your books are very clear. I recommend them to our audience. How can people purchase your books and learn more about you?
People can learn more about me on my website, bgapublications.nl, but I don't sell my books, and my books are available through the usual channels, the large online book shops, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, etc., etc.
Okay. Well, we've had a very interesting philosophical, spiritual, and political discussion. My name is Dr. Joseph Burkes. I'm a semi-retired internal medicine physician, and I'd like to thank Mr. Joseph Champion, who is our producer and co-owner of the Inception Radio Network, as well as Mr. Ken Cherry for giving me the opportunity to be your host. And it's time now to say, remember, if you are out in the field and you see a UFO, Don't just stand there with your mouth open. Send a thought to it, move to the left or to the right, or signal at it with a flashlight. Because if they do signal back, this confirms that they are very likely to be of anomalous nature and not, say, the United States or the Mexican Air Force on maneuvers. So stay healthy, stay strong, and thank you so much for listening. My name is Dr. Joseph Burkes. I wish you all good night.
Thank you for being with us tonight. Please join us again next Monday evening for Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council's Epic Voyages. I'm Roger Peacock for Epic. Until next time.